Well, what is Joseph Smith's connection to Masonry, by the way? Joseph was not a Mason. As a matter of fact, the earliest known source of Joseph saying anything about Masonry is clear back in 1830 to the Colesville branch. He simply says, "Beware the Freemasons." There was a feeling of mistrust of Masonry earlier on, but there were early church members who were Masons, and it was not uncommon for people to be a Freemason during this time period. Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball were longtime Masons. And in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith's brother Hiram was a Mason, as was Joseph's counselor at the time and political advisor, a man named John C. Bennett. They had helped organize a Masonic lodge in Nauvoo, and Joseph, ever the learner, ever someone interested in grasping and understand things, started to become interested in it as well. So in March of 1842, Joseph Smith was taught about Masonry, and he became an entered apprentice and ultimately a master Mason himself in March of 1842 as a lodge was set up there in Nauvoo, Illinois. Now, it's not coincidental. Notice those dates. That was in March of 1842. Joseph gives the first presentation of the endowment ceremony in May of 1842. 6 weeks later, that I don't think is coincidental. I also don't think it's coincidental from the earlier quote that I read you about George Miller, Heber C. Kimball, Brigham Young, Hiram Smith, all those 9 men who on May 4th, 1842, participated in the first presentation of the endowment in the red brick store. All 9 of those men were Masons as well. Why? Well, likely because Joseph chose those men because they would understand the ceremony. They would understand the connections. They would make sense of it as a whole. So what I'm trying to say is there is a connection. So really quickly, this isn't a video on the history of Freemasonry as a whole, but I want to give you a quick, brief background. I'm going to read a little bit to you from my friend and colleague and scholar Steve Harper in his article, Freemasonry and the LDS Temple Endowment, in a book called A Reason for Faith. He says this, summarizes it: members of a Masonic lodge hold elaborate meetings in which they retell stories of the ancient origins of Masons who were among those Solomon commissioned to build a temple in Jerusalem. These stories both entertain and teach members to be loyal and worthy of each other's trust as well as God's. In their meetings, Masons acted out and enlarged the brief biblical account of Hiram of Tyre, a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali. In the Masonic story, Solomon charges Hiram to build the temple. Hiram refuses to reveal the word of the master Mason to some of his subordinates and is murdered for his fidelity. Emulating Hiram, Masons ritually advanced by degrees from entered apprentice to fellow craft to master Mason, using gestures, secret words, and ritual clothing. As a person advanced in the order, he metaphorically went deeper into Solomon's temple on a quest for more light. And this image right here of the compass and the square with the G in the middle is the symbol of Masonry as a whole. And they use the compass and the square to symbolize different things. Masonry is trying to take, it's a fraternity of men. One of the things they're trying to do is teach men how to be good, moral, righteous men as a whole, and to live righteous principles, and to care for each other, and to care for their widows and family members who may be left behind. It's meant, in essence, it's meant to support each other. It's unsure, and Freemasonry scholars, and from what I've read about it, it's unclear when Masonry itself develops. It probably started in Europe around 1300 AD as kind of a trade guild where Masons, like literally, these are brick and stone Masons, could support each other in their masonry work. They could teach each other about the craft, about the tools of the trade, etc. And they also start to share other knowledge with each other and support each other. And it develops into this fraternity to help men this way. Over the years, and by 1700, it's a common esoteric fraternity. You've all heard that George Washington was a Mason. You've heard that Benjamin Franklin was a Mason. I like to joke around that Nicolas Cage was a Mason. But other people were, Teddy Roosevelt, Harry Truman, etc. There's beautiful Masonic temples all throughout the world and the United States as a whole. Well, why is there some overlap between the two then, between the presentation of the endowment, even in that brief review, those who have been and participated in the temple, you can see connections. Why is there overlap between some of the areas? Well, there's 2 general theories. One that I like to call the apostasy theory, the other I like to call the adoption theory. The apostasy theory is that Masonry did tap into ancient orders and ways of doing things and knowledge, but that it was a secular, or maybe, and I don't mean this pejoratively, an apostatized version of ancient rituals and symbols and ceremonies. And that what Joseph was doing was Joseph was restoring it to its original higher purposes. Instead of talking about Hiram of Tyre, let's learn about the plan of salvation and use the story of Adam and Eve. Instead of using the clothing to symbolize these different orders, let's connect it to priesthood and covenants. Instead of teaching people about faith, hope, charity, let's teach people about obedience and sacrifice and consecration, etc. Instead of going deeper into Solomon's temple, we progress until we come into the presence of God in the celestial kingdom. The apostasy theory, here's Heber C. Kimball. Here's some quotes on it. We have received some precious things through the prophet on the priesthood, which would cause your soul to rejoice. This is a letter that he writes to Parley P. Pratt. I cannot give them to you on paper, for they are not to be written. So you must come and get them for yourself. There is a similarity of priesthood in Masonry. Brother Joseph says Masonry was taken from priesthood, but has become degenerated. But many things are perfect. That's Heber C. Kimball, and you can see the apostasy theory there. Willard Richards writes, Masonry had its origin in the priesthood. A hint to the wise is sufficient. So there's that. Maybe Joseph is restoring it. That's the apostasy theory. The adoption theory is that Joseph Smith learned all of these concepts over a decade of his prophetic ministry, and that when he became a Mason and participated in their ceremonies, he in essence went, that's really effective. I like how they're doing that, but I'm going to adopt it and adapt it to my purposes to teach these concepts that God has taught me. And that's the adoption theory. Here's Stephen Harper on the adoption theory. Joseph started with what he had and used what the saints found familiar to lead them to further light and knowledge. Perhaps Joseph thought of Masonic ideas and practices as a way to impart knowledge that was suited to the simplest of saints and rich enough to reward a lifetime's journey toward God. Or historian Richard Bushman from Ruststone Rolling put it this way: Joseph often requested revelation about things that caught his attention. He had a green thumb for growing ideas from tiny seeds. It's a wonderful line. Masonic rites seem to have been one more provocation. Intrigued by the Masonic rites, Joseph turned the material to his own use. The Masonic elements that appeared in the temple endowment were embedded in a distinctive context: the creation instead of the Temple of Solomon, exaltation rather than fraternity, God and Christ, not the worshipful master. Temple covenants bound people to God rather than to each other. At the end, the participants entered symbolically into the presence of God. Endowment, Joseph's name for the temple ceremony, connected it to promises made long before his encounter with Freemasonry. That's from Rough Stone Rolling. Here's, by the way, the church's own summary of it, using both of those. There are different ways to understand the relationship between Masonry and the temple. Some Latter-day Saints point to similarities between the format and symbols of both the endowment and Masonic rituals, and those of many ancient religious ceremonies as evidence that the endowment was a restoration of an ancient ordinance. Others note that the ideas and institutions in the culture that surrounded Joseph Smith frequently contributed to the process by which he obtained revelation. In any event, the endowment did not simply imitate the rituals of Freemasonry. Rather, Joseph's encounter with Masonry evidently served as a catalyst for revelation. And that's maybe one point as I move off Masonry here and its overlap. Whether it's the adoption theory or the apostasy theory, to me is irrelevant. For me personally, as section 128 of the Doctrine and Covenants teaches, that when those in prophetic authority do things truly and faithfully in the name of the Lord, and by virtue of the prophetic keys and the sealing power, it becomes law recognized by God on earth and in heaven. So whatever the origin of the overlap, either way, Joseph, as the authorized prophet of God, initiated these ceremonies that have become the binding law or the binding ordinances and covenants, the binding priesthood ritual by which you and I enter into this sacred order of priests to one day receive the fullness of the priesthood from God, to become exalted. That, to me, is what is important. These are the ordinances through a prophet using his keys recognized by God as a whole.